In the 1950s, the British government was involved in the war in Oman, fighting to extend the territorial control of the Sultan of Muscat, Said bin Taimur, in return for access to the country's oil, resisted by Omani tribes in the interior, led by the Imam Ghalib bin Ali bin Hilal al-Hinai. Over the years, the Sultan began suffering setbacks, and the war became a stalemate, leading the British government to decide that an attack by their army against the Imam's forces in their mountain strongholds would be required to put an end to the conflict. In 1959, the Special Air Service, or SAS, the British military's special forces, attacked. Organised resistance against the Sultan's rule broke, and the Imam fled to Saudi Arabia. In London, the War Office published a list of medals awarded in recognition of gallant and distinguished service in the Arabian Peninsula. One of those who was awarded a military cross was one Lieutenant Peter de la Billière, his citation saying that he found and raided a cave being used by a large rebel party, inflicting heavy losses upon them. Decades later, de la Billière would go from being an SAS officer to commander of all British forces in the Gulf War after the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein's regime in 1990. It's part of what happened after the war, though, that we're going to look at today. When the war finished, de la Billière had a money problem. He was involved in some insurance business which all began to go wrong right as he deployed to Saudi Arabia in late 1990. In short, in the 1980s, Lloyd's of London insurance bank investors allegedly decided to essentially scam people out of their money in order to save their own money. It was guessed that there'd be lots of money lost throughout the decade due to claims about asbestos-related health problems, and so it was allegedly decided that a recruit-to-dilute scheme would be adopted. More people would be enticed to enter into insurance underwritings, which is where people offer to pay for the losses on financial ventures, so that more people would be responsible for the anticipated losses, and so Lloyd's members involved in the scheme could escape financial harm by, in the words of one Lloyd's insider, dumping it on ignorant outsiders so they could bear all the losses, rather than themselves. While I don't know if de la Billière was tricked by this recruit-to-dilute scheme or just unlucky enough to being caught up in its effects, many of the insurance syndicates affected by this were on de la Billière's portfolio, and he lost perhaps up to £400,000. In 1992, de la Billière published his book on the Gulf War, Storm Command. Many claim that his money problems played a large part in him taking up writing. The first ever book on the SAS from an inside perspective came out in 1987, about the 1980 Iranian embassy siege. The author was banned from the regiment's camp, banned from supporting the regimental rugby team, and was under the threat of having his army pension cut off. This would set the pattern for what would follow Storm Command in 1992. In the book, de la Billière lays out the events of Bravo 20, an SAS raid during the Gulf War, which went wrong, leading to the deaths of many of the soldiers and the capture and torture of many others. In 1992, the 5 surviving members of Bravo 20 were invited by de la Billière to Christmas dinner, where his literary agent was also present. The general's plan was to write an entire book about the failed operation. Storm Command, however, was already having some consequences. De la Billière was banned by the SAS from regimental functions for speaking about Bravo 20. His next book in 1994, Looking for Trouble, also caused problems for talking about the SAS. Basically, the SAS is a very secretive organisation and do not like to have their recent exploits known about, so were not exactly appreciative of de la Billière's writing. They were even less appreciative, however, though de la Billière had no control over this, of the number of books about the SAS that de la Billière inspired with his own. In 1996, de la Billière would step down as president of the Special Air Service Regimental Association amid hostility from within the SAS against him for his books, leading his defenders to cite his financial issues at the end of the Gulf War as a reason for why he had to write the books and break the SAS code of silence, and so he wasn't doing it for no reason. His agent would claim that he just thought he'd been president long enough, but that his books were a big reason for him stepping down is proven by future events. The next year, de la Billière would be banned from attending an SAS reunion. He wasn't the only one. Numerous authors of books about the SAS had been informed by the Ministry of Defence that they were barred from visiting the regimental barracks in Hereford, or from attending remembrance services, with the Ministry saying that The restriction applies to all those who have acted against the Special Forces' interests by publishing information about them. The thing is, though, de la Billière hadn't received a letter from the ministry telling him that he was subject to this ban. The ban was actually brought in 1996, alongside serving and newly joining members now having to sign a contract saying they wouldn't release any information about the regiment. The reason that de la Billière didn't receive any formal letter saying that he was banned was more than likely due to the fact that he was a highly decorated officer, and the government just didn't want to tell him bluntly that he was banned from visiting his old unit. Of course, not everyone in the SAS or the government felt the same way. Some saw the banning of de la Billière as an insult, or that he was being scapegoated for other people having published their own books, but reportedly the overwhelming feeling was one of anger against him. The general himself didn't accept that he was actually banned because of the book, on account of the fact, he argued, that his books had been cleared for publication by the SAS and the Ministry of Defence. However, it was clearly that he'd broken the informal code of silence the regiment likes to keep, and had unwittingly led to numerous other books on the SAS being published since 1992. By 2001, the controversy over SAS books hadn't lessened, and if anything, it had got worse for two reasons. The first was the war in Afghanistan in 2001, and the second was the seemingly impending Iraq War. In particular, multiple literary agents in 2001 wanted to sign book deals with SAS soldiers to tell all following news of a raid on the mountain base of Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. The problem for the agents was, however, the new confidentiality agreement SAS soldiers had to agree to from 1996. Some agents also saw the nature of the Afghan war as a problem, seeing it as having been too quick and not interesting enough to make a good book. But when the invasion of Iraq was looming, especially in 2002, there was more hope among literary agents for a new Bravo 20-esque book. As one news article of the time put it, talking about two agents who'd published SAS books before, neither wants a war, but, if it happens, they think it could provide another crop of dynamic tales. The SAS and Special Boat Service have been in and around Iraq for weeks, perhaps months. Doubtless these patrols have already been unbelievably brave, but their adventures aren't enough to turn into a mega-selling book. What is required is a full-scale war. Naturally, the British government did not want any more books on the SAS being published. Ever since Storm Command in 1992, the formerly secretive regiment was becoming too well known for their liking. More to the point, it was sometimes causing PR problems. One book, published about the Bravo 20 operation for example, talked about the author's opinions on toxic internal politics and egotism in the SAS, as well as criticising his officers' abilities, at the encouragement of the publisher who wanted the book to be spiced up a little. The author also criticised one of his dead comrades, leading to backlash from the regiment. Other books had opened up on the fact that many in the SAS had unhappy marriages and drinking problems, and now many of the regiment's members were embroiled in accusations about lying and exaggerating one's own exploits for money or fame, or downplaying anything which might get in the way of that, as well as accusations of cowardice, incompetence and more. In 2000, a book by a former SAS Sergeant Major was published rebuking lots of the claims made by previous books, and complaining that the authors were making themselves look like Rambo-style superheroes for money. The book controversy was even spilling out onto other countries. Also in 2000, a New Zealander veteran of Bravo 20 went to court over the right to tell his side of the story, and argued that the SAS leadership were to blame for the total failure of the operation, but the British government didn't want his book published. The entire court case, which the British government would spend over $1 million New Zealand dollars on, was conducted as secretly as possible, with government and military witnesses never coming in through the front door, and they weren't able to be seen by journalists. It was actually at this court hearing that the 1992 Christmas dinner with de la Billière, where he met with Bravo 20 veterans about writing a book about their mission, was revealed. Part of the reason why the New Zealand veteran had wanted to write his book was because an internal SAS report came out, criticising a member of Bravo 20 as having endangered his comrades and for not being professional, leading to further arguments and defences and publicity, and the veteran wanted to defend his dead comrade's reputation. The British government claimed that the book couldn't be published because each new book on the SAS gave away information on their operating style, which they feared would be used by terrorist organisations, foreign intelligence services, and others to make countermeasures against future SAS operations. In their minds, any more books on the regiment would not only risk the lives of the soldiers, but be a national security risk as well. There was also the issue that if this book were published, then members of other organisations, like the Secret Service, might want to publish their memoirs too. The arguments against the government were that the confidentiality agreements were blatant limitations on freedom of expression, as well as outrage about the fact that British veterans had been able to publish their books, while a New Zealander was being blocked, leading to accusations of a colonialist mindset by the government, especially from New Zealanders. The veteran's lawyer declared that if we lose, there will be no more books saying what really happens. The only books you will read about the SAS will be the ones the Ministry of Defence approves, and they will be propaganda. In the event, his book would be published in 2004. There was also a question of classism involved in all of these controversies. The various authors were relatively low-ranking officers, such as sergeants, and they were being ostracised for writing about their own experiences and criticising the government and military for what they perceived as incompetence, which led to the deaths of their comrades. Of course, de la Bellière was also ostracised from the regiment, but major consequences only followed after other veterans began to publish their own books. In fact, his 1992 book had even gotten a foreword written by the Prince of Wales. The Sergeant Major's book in 2000, which defended the regiment and its officers against various authors, didn't receive any negative publicity from the government. It was only when the lower-ranking officers tried to criticise their leadership that the government and military began stepping down. Similarly, the first ever book by a female veteran was entirely pulled from circulation in 2000, due to the author criticising both the officers she served under during the Troubles and the sexism that pervaded the regiment. So, in 2003, with the impending invasion of Iraq, the British government didn't want any more SAS books. The thing is, though, just like de la Bellière protested in 1997, books on the SAS had to undergo government and military censorship before publishing. So the government only really had itself to blame for what was happening, because they had to approve the books for publishing, which they seemed to do for all so far, save for the New Zealanders. In August of that year, however, de la Bellière once more ran into trouble for the book he'd published over a decade earlier. That month, an SAS veteran called Lieutenant Colonel Ian Smith died, and de la Bellière went to attend his funeral, following an invitation to do so. On arrival, however, a sergeant major asked de la Bellière to leave, as the ban against him attending SAS events was still in place. As far as I can tell, it's still in place now, and more books have still been published over the years by SAS veterans, while others have even appeared on TV shows to give interviews.